Hey everyone and welcome! I'm Susan Smith and you're in my studio Stitched by Susan. I have coffee in hand, ready for a late afternoon, early evening for me of quilting. And if my face is a bit shiny, it's the first warm day in eastern Washington state, and so we're not quite acclimatized yet. We're feeling a little hot. Anyway, it's going to be a great day for quilting, no matter what. Today's topic is working on a quilt. The backing of it, I pieced on an episode 2 weeks ago. So look for zipper backing if you want to see the details. And there's, I think there's a link in the show description as well. But this pieced backing was because I had two kinds of fabrics and not enough of either one. So this is kind of a creative way of piecing it. But what I want to focus on showing you today is the quilting, of course, but also the loading at the long arm, and show you that a quilt back, even a large quilt back, does not have to be perfectly squared up before you load it at the long arm. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about my loading process and how that works and how I can still get a flat and square result, because it's a massive time saver for you at the long arm. Then I will go into the quilting. So we'll do, it's going to be my all over feather design. So we'll do quite a bit of quilting, but because it is a big quilt and I want to get quite a bit done, I thought what I'd do today is not do a lot of talking while I'm quilting, but just kind of heads down, go at my more typical working pace, if you will. But I will stop sometimes between passes. So if you have questions or comments, put in a double QQ, and ask your questions, and then we'll be able to pull them up and load them. So a huge thanks to my son Will for that fun intro with the little Australian accent, and those of you who are Aussies.
We haven't done that.
I'm sorry. I'm confused.
You did the whole topic, and I thought you were going to come back to it.
Mr. Producer's laughing at me. I'm disorganized and not really reading the screen. How shall we do this, hon? Let's just keep going. Let's pause for a second, let Will do his intro, and then we'll dive back in.
Welcome to Live and Unscripted with Susan Smith, quilting's first reality show.
Hey everyone, Susan here again. Today's been a day of kind of missed starts, but you know, that's what live TV is all about, isn't it? As my son Will said in that little intro, we call this quilting's first reality show because we are live streaming this episode. And so you are getting to see even my trips and stumbles over my speaking, but certainly warts and all the quilting that's coming up today. So I'm quite excited about this project. I'm going to set my coffee cup down.
You're going to say hi to me.
And I'm going to, first off, offer a couple thanks before we dive into the show, because this is one that I certainly could not do by myself. So the first one is to Will, who does those great voices for me at the beginning. He's just a fan of imitating voices, and it's fun to have him do my introductions. That's our son. And then also my husband, Mr. Producer, who is the chap who keeps all the balls in the air at the same time, more or less, even when I drop them and fumble. And also our good friend, Dan Unger, whose guitar music you will hear throughout. And he graciously allows us to play that for you, and it is so lovely. We love it. Also, I do want to say too, if you're new to these live and unscripted episodes, or if you've been watching them for a long time, YouTube and Facebook, as always, are free for your enjoyment. However, if you do want to support our channel, there is a way you can do that, and it simply is by going to buymeacoffee.com/StitchedBySusan. And there, for as little as $5, you can make a donation, and all of those funds go right into improving our equipment over time. And if you want to know what we've done with that, look back at some episodes from 3 years ago, and you'll see the difference. Enough said. So we sure appreciate all of you that contribute to that. And at the very end of the show, when the credits roll, we have our monthly contributors' names are on that. So if you want to see your name in bright lights, that's where it'll be. Okay. Let's get into today's topic, which I kind of dived into already. It's this idea of not having to square up a backing as you're loading it, even when it's large. And this is a great example of it. I'm going to try and hold it up. Can we have the side camera maybe?
Yeah.
So that they can see? So as I mentioned, 2 Fridays ago, I think it was on a Saturday actually that time, 2 weeks ago, I showed the sewing of this backing, so I call it a zippered backing, which is just a kind of softening of the transition between two different fabrics because I didn't have enough of either one. And it was tricky to find something in this Wedgwood blue when we come to the quilt top. You'll see it's a very 90s color, and it was hard to match. And I had this larger print, and I found this one at the store, and so together I had enough. So this was my way of kind of softening that transition, blending them together. But let me show you this end too. You can see my ends were not all exactly the same length. So I have a big chunk here, and my little zippered piece in the middle. And I'm going to show you how we can load that without having to go to the trouble of wrangling the quilt and squaring that all up. So let's flip this over. And it is quite a large quilt. And when I load a quilt, if you've watched me before, you'll know that sometimes I load them top to bottom, and sometimes I load the length of the quilt side to side, because it's more efficient to have the length of the quilt, honestly, running this way. But for today's purposes, I am doing it top to bottom because I want my seams from my backing to be from side to side so I can manage where they are. And also, I have a straight edge at the front because it's a selvage. And this is key to this method of loading, is that you have one straight edge for your front. Now, it does not have to be a selvage, but that's a guaranteed straight edge. So when I can, I do use the selvage, and today we are able to. I'm just going to lay it over my rails to kind of establish my position, if you will, at the long arm and see whether I need to move left or right. And I've got Stella, the long arm, way down here at my left. And I have little clamps that I can latch her onto the rails. So I've kind of latched her off to the side while I'm loading this big quilt so she doesn't get in the way. And then we'll get started. Now I use the red snapper loading system, red snappers. And the way this works is within my leader, my canvas leader, there's a tiny red rod that's part of the set. And so now I can just lay my fabric edge over that little rod and snap this one on, hence the red snappers, and work my way along this edge of the quilt. Now again, because I have a selvage, I don't have to worry too much about it stretching. If this was a cut edge, I would be very careful that I'm neither overstretching nor easing my fabric. You want it to be very flat. This first side is the most important one in terms of getting a straight result. You've got to start off with a straight foundation. So again, I'm using my perfectly straight edge along my leader to gauge the placement and to make sure that it is running straight. Perfect for 2 red snappers. At that point, I toss all the rest of the backing over my further rail. And I wonder if we can't see this end, can we? No, I think I'll just show it from here. I'll walk around and show it a little bit. I'll just show you how my leaders go, because some of you will have rails that are situated similarly to mine. The way my quilt works is it's going to go under a leveler bar or a dead bar and then roll up on this top roller. And so what I've done is wrapped my leader around that dead bar and over the top. And I've done other episodes where I showed a little more in detail of that, if you want to see it. But for those of you who are wondering, how's it going to come out right when you unwind it? That's how it comes out right. Okay, so the entire bulk of the quilt back now is over the long arm rails. And I'm just going to pull it all across nice and smooth. And the next really critical thing to watch for is that it's coming straight over the rails. It's not running to one side or the other. Watch what happens if it is off to one side, even ½ an inch. Can you see I start to get angled pull lines? Not sure if they show on camera, but I can sure see them here. And so I adjust my fabric then so that I'm positive it is flowing straight over this rail. That too is really important. From there, I get my trusty spray water bottle and I lightly spritz the fabric. And this is in lieu of pressing it. It's been folded for a while. It's got some creases in it. But I don't take the time to press my backings. I do this light spritz of water. All the creases relax, and it's good to go for quilting. Perfect. From there, making sure this whole quilt backing is nice and flat, and then I will start rolling it on. And what's going to happen, let me come around again so you can see me. What's going to happen is because I've got a beautiful straight edge here, and because it is straight over the rails, when I crank it up now, the tension, the resistance of this fabric coming over that leader is going to help it pull on absolutely evenly. And you might have to just trust me on this if you've never tried it before, but I've done hundreds of quilts this way and they come out beautifully square. So I'm just rolling up my backing. And if I see any creases or unevenness or puckers forming along the rail, then I just come along and make adjustments. Use my judgment again that it's not veering to one side or the other. If I have a straight edge, and I sometimes do have a straight cut edge on one side, I can watch that as it's rolling up. And it's another gauge to know that it's all going straight. Can you see how that's happening? Just that little bit of resistance from the canvas leader is helping this fabric to lay on perfectly smoothly or to roll on smoothly. And I'm just picking a few little dark fuzzies off here because it is white fabric. And I do not want to quilt in any blue bits of thread if I can help it. Okay, we'll keep going. And I'm watching under that long leader to see when the end of my backing is approaching the end of the leader. And at that point, I come around and pick off a few more threads. And I just roll my leader up, smooth my backing the last little bit, and we're just talking millimeters at this point. And I keep one of my magnets, which you'll see me using later on the front rail. I keep one on this side of the frame, and I tuck it on one side as a kind of anchor or pin while I'm putting my snapper on the other side, because every so often I've had my fabric slip right off the top. Mr. Producer is helping by picking threads.
I saw them on camera.
It's kind of funny, you guys. I actually thoroughly vacuumed my studio today. But this backing I had out last week when I was working on it, or the week before, and clearly the floor held some threads at that point. Yes, I don't want to quilt them in, that is for sure. So now then, before I roll it, let's talk a minute about what happened there. So this is the edge. Can I see myself, Dave, so I know whether I'm on or not? My right-hand side is the edge that had the uneven piecing where the seams joined up. And I saw them coming and going by. And the truth is, that's not going to hurt this way. That's not going to hurt the squareness of my quilt at all. I just need to be aware of that. The one that is closer to me at this side is a little bit shorter. So when I place my quilt on this end, I need to be aware of that in its placement. But in every other way, that's not going to affect the squareness of my quilt at all. Furthermore, I started with that front straight edge. If my final edge had not been straight, I would have just let the excess hang off that side. So can you see how none of those three sides have to be laboriously squared up with a ruler and a cutting mat and folded in quarters and all the things that you do to square a big backing? All that's necessary is that you have a straight front edge to work with, that you don't stretch, and that you roll it on smoothly and evenly. And again, I'll say, I've done hundreds of quilts this way with really good success. To me, 1/4 inch is my margin of error, and I get quilts within 1/4 inch of square all the time. So, perfectly successful. Let me just finish rolling this, and then we'll take a few questions about this. And I certainly didn't time it today, but I know from experience, I can load a queen-sized quilt this way in about 6 minutes. A queen size backing. Let's be clear about that. Okay, some questions. And some coffee. Shyla, how do I ensure a straight edge if my backing does not have a selvage? Then you need to trim up that one edge, and it should be as straight on grain as possible too. That will help with how it's pulling onto the rails smoothly, if that grain is straight and pulling evenly as well. And if you're desperate, you can do what we seamstresses used to do to find the straight of grain, which is pull one thread, and that will mark a line that's perfectly on the straight of grain. Karen, will the zipper be centered when the quilting is complete? Great question, Karen. When I was thinking this through before loading the quilt, my preference would have been for about 1/3 to be one fabric and 2/3 to be the other fabric. But in actual practice, it's going to fall in the middle. And here's why. My quilt is 84 inches long. So I've got about 42 each of each fabric, plus that 5 inches of zipper in the middle. And so I need that leeway for my loading beginning and end. So it might be 2 inches off center, but that's about all. So you work with what you've got. Pam, as I'm nearing the end of my quilt, my batting seems to be bunching up towards the center. Any idea what I might be doing wrong? Actually, a really good idea, Pam. That's another good question. You'll see me as I'm working today. Whenever I roll up the quilt and advance it, you'll see me walk along the front, tugging on it, and I'm tugging both the quilt top and the batting. For whatever reason, and I don't know what it is exactly, the batting always wants to veer toward the center like this. And I suspect it's because those cut edges of batting, they stretch out just a little bit. And it doesn't take very much of those stretching to have it starting to turn this shape, right? So that's what you're combating. So by pulling up those edges a little with each advance and by tugging down the center a little with each advance, you can totally alleviate that. The key is to address it with each advance and not wait till you're at the bottom of the quilt and now you have a pleat in the middle and you don't have anywhere to go with it. Okay, so let's grab our batting.
So I have a phone mute for a second.
We're just fiddling with cameras and audio here. So you're going to turn that camera off for a few minutes? Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Yes, you're just going to be on this one.
So I'm just working on the batting, you guys, and you've seen this on a million other quilts. I've actually got a piece of batting that's way, way, way too wide. So I'm going to do something I do from time to time as well, which is trim it up. I just wonder. I'm just thinking, and I'm out of camera thinking. Sorry about that. Dave, would you mind handing me my scissors? They're right there on the corner of my table. I'm not going to explain the mental math I'm going through right now. Just trust me, okay? There is some mental math about this batting. I took a piece that I had already cut, thinking I was arranging my quilt the opposite way, you know, crossways on my frame, but I'm doing it long ways, so I need to trim the batting, so just trust me on this one. It's another process for another episode. Take the shorter one off. Whoops, put a hole in the wall. Toss that one aside for the next quilt. I do purchase my batting, I will say this one. I purchased my batting on 120-inch wide rolls so that I have the most possible for often when I'm doing lap quilts, I can get two side by side, for example, where if I only bought 90-inch wide batting, I wouldn't be able to do that. Am I still turning it the wrong way? Yes, I am. It's got to go this way. I know in my head which direction is the longest one, and this is it. So it is still plenty wide. We may end up trimming that again, but I didn't want to cut twice, as my dad used to say. cut it twice and it's still too short. He did a lot of carpentry work and I did not want to do that. So now I'm going to have to cut it twice to get it right. And here's how I do it when I'm cutting often, by the way, is I will fold up the layers, and I actually can see the fold of my batting, so I know that I'm getting it fairly straight. And the reason I'm taking the time to do this, I certainly could trim it off after the quilt is finished, but having this bulky stuff here extending beyond the edge of my backing is a real nuisance when you're quilting, and I don't think it's worth the trouble. Like, I'm frugal too. I don't want to waste batting, but it makes quilting much more difficult, so I don't think it's worth it. So off it goes. That was a multi-part process, wasn't it? Phew, batting's all in place. Now you get to see the quilt. Here comes the quilt.
Question on the batting board.
Look how pretty. Sure, I'll take a question on the batting while I spread this out. What if the backing runs over the area where the machine sits, meaning backing completely takes up available rail area? Does this method still work? Well, I'll tell you what, you really can't load a quilt that takes every inch of rail area because you have to have somewhere for the machine to go. I've done things that are really, really wide, and I suppose you could move your machine and put it in the middle and shift it as you're loading different areas. I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever loaded a quilt like this, though, that I couldn't put my machine at the end. I don't think I have. So that's my answer. Maybe you can, but I haven't done it. We've got the quilt on. And we already know this is going to be a fun process because no squaring up happened when this quilt was being made. However, whoever made it did a really good job of piecing it. Like, it lays pretty flat. I'm going to point out to you one other thing that I'm going to talk about a bit today while I quilt it. And that is this one right here. Can you see it? There's two blocks like this that have the kind of quarter fan with eyelet lace on them. And so I want to keep that lace, you know, loose and three-dimensional. So I'll talk a little bit about how I work my design around those. And I chose a quilting design that's fairly fine so that I can do that. Okay, Stella, we'll let you out of jail. I am using for thread today, it's Isacord 100% poly, and the color number is 0184. And you can kind of see the one that's on the machine. It's a very, very pale, almost silver. It's my new favorite neutral. Somehow, it's a bit magical. Somehow it's kind of, it takes on the color of what it's with, and it works even with white. It just looks like a shadow on white. So this quilt is cream and very blue. So I looked at a cream thread, which worked too, but it showed up so distinctly on some of the blues. And so I thought this little neutral, slightly silvery one was a great choice. So now I'm just basting. I have a 1/4 inch basting stitch on, and I'm just going to baste up the left side, across the top, and down the right. And this too I've talked about in other episodes a little more. There are different quilters have different theories about this. Some of them always baste top down, some of them always baste bottom up. You can do whatever works for you as long as you're achieving squareness and flatness, in my opinion. And this works for me. And it's quick. Those little red lights, by the way, that you may be seeing are my stitch regulator cameras. There's 2 of them embedded in the foot plate. Now, one other interesting thing. On this right-hand side, all the way down the quilt, it looks like, yes, is a selvage edge, not a raw edge of fabric. So I'm actually going to baste a wee bit wider on this side, like 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to trim a little bit of that edge off when the quilt is done, just because it does not feel the same as the rest of the quilt. You know how a selvage edge is. It's kind of tight and even a little thicker. So I don't really want that inside my quilt. So I'm going to trim off just the very, very teeny tiniest edge, maybe 1/8 of an inch when I trim up the quilt. So there's my basting done. And now that that is done, I'm going to put side clamps on. I use...
Saying your magnet is on the back? Here, did you leave a magnet on the back?
It's on the back table, yes. Whoever's asking about my magnet on the back, it lives on the table. That's my pinning magnet for loading. It lives back there. So now I'm putting my side clamps on. These are also by Red Snapper. I believe they're called E-edge clamps. I like them because they're deep. Let me move Stella so you can see. I can't really move Stella so you can see. Okay, we'll see more at this end.
Yeah, I'm just going to move the camera.
Beautiful. Mr. Producer's moving the camera so you guys can see.
Shake on their end, but...
Okay, here's my snapper. They're slim from top to bottom. That's what I love about them. And also they hold across most of the throat space. I love that about them. So there are probably lots of other side clamps that work this way too, but that is why I love these. And I just put enough tension on to hold my quilt snug. I don't want to be beating on a drum. I just want it to be snug. So front to back and side to side, I can still reach under with my fingers and I can grab my fingertips. Like, it is not drum tight, but it is snug enough that there's no creases able to form. And then I pull out my trusty magnets, which are these magnetic bars. They're about 1 inch wide. They're just hardware store variety, and they go along my front rail. So this is all part of my loading system, if you will. A lot of quilters roll their top or roll their backing, but usually their top onto this top roller. And so there's multiple layers of fabric. So this idea of floating the top appeals to me because it's quicker and I have no trouble keeping a straight quilt. But if I don't have my quilt on a roller on the front, I do need to secure this edge in some way so that it's not pulling up, like you were talking about the batting pulling up earlier. I don't want the quilt to pull up either as I'm working on it. So that's what these magnets do, is they secure this front edge. So now my whole working space rectangle can't move when I'm quilting. And when I go to advance it, you'll see the process then. Okay, you guys, that's about enough talking for a little while. We're going to get quilting. I'm going to quilt my all-over feather design.
Before you start, or no, you want to...
Sure, we can take some questions before we start, but I will say I'm going to quilt my all-over feather design, which some of you may be familiar with. There are certainly other episodes that feature it, and there is definitely a link in the description below this episode, and it's a free class, so you're welcome to take that at any time. Okay, question?
Yep, I'm getting there.
Here it comes. Here it comes. Wilma. Her directions have totally squared and flattened my quilt. So obviously you've tried this method, Wilma, and found really good success with it. I'm happy to hear that. And I think I've tried to make clear that it's kind of a whole system. You sort of can't take bits and pieces of it. You can't just not bother squaring and then not take measures to get a square quilt. You do have to do things, but they're very time-saving. Nita, how long is your frame, Susan? It is 12 feet, Nita. Rianne, do you always baste before you put clamps on? I do. My reasoning is I prefer all the layers to be stitched together and then put the clamps on so all the layers have the same tension, as opposed to clamping the back and then smoothing on the batting and the top, because I feel like there's some distortion going on then. Tanya, what is the writing on the quilt behind you? Oh, this is a friendship quilt, Tanya. One of my earlier students in my freehand quilting masterclass organized this, and she contacted students all around the world who created blocks and signed them. And Joan Parker, who made it, collected all those blocks, assembled the quilt, made the binding, made the backing, and then I quilted it actually in an earlier episode, and it's called the Friendship Quilt. So you can watch me quilt it if you want to. That's what the signatures are. Janet from Pennsylvania, enjoying my first live show finally. It took me forever to load on the frame till you showed your way, and I love it. Great time saver. Thank you. And I will say too, I was not the first person to come up with this bright idea. Loading Lori's Way is a YouTube video from maybe 15 years ago, like early YouTube, circa 2000 probably. 2010 maybe. Anyway, loading Lori's way, it's a longer, more involved method, but that's where I first had this idea of floating the top and of just rolling that backing and allowing that tension to help me. Anita is saying that she's having trouble getting her side clamps on, and do I have any hints? Nita, scroll through my YouTube and do some searches for side clamps, because I've done some short videos, some reels at different times, and I do have one little YouTube video on loading those clamps that gives kind of a close-up of the channel you're trying to get the fabric in, and some tips for when you have wobbly or wavy fabric, and just some tips. Wanda, how are the strips that are attached to your edge of backing attached to your machine? So that system came with my machine when I purchased it, but it's very simple. It's 2-inch wide, ultra sticky, two-sided sticky tape. So we applied the tape to the rails first, and then we applied the leader with great care, and they're permanent. Another one, Shyla, I'm trying to find the orientation of the leader and how it rolls at the beginning of quilting. In terms of how my leaders are on the rails, it's exactly like the description in my manual, right? So Bernina supplies a manual, and if you've got another brand, they'll supply one too. I didn't change where I fix the leaders. The only thing I changed is my rail that is right in front of me does not have a leader on it at all. And my backing goes all the way down to the roller that the top would usually be loaded on, but I still applied the leaders in the same way. Hope that helps.
You can answer this one if you want.
Could you show the take-up bar before you start? How could we do that? Sure, Mr. Producer says he will. So bear with us.
Shake.
We'll move the camera. It's going to be wobbly, but you will be able to see it. I'll get out from behind the background. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, it's going to be shaky, but we will show you from the front side of the machine. So here's the take-up bar. Okay, so my canvas leader is under that, and my quilt is going to roll up under it and then roll up on this top rail. And you're seeing the long armor's tape measure on here as well. I use that as a reference point to keep my quilt, the edge of it, square and straight, and I've just stuck that on with 3M double-sided sticky tape as well. So nothing too fancy there, but very practical. Okay, is that all the questions, hon?
I think so.
Okay, you guys, we're going to get quilting. Again, I mentioned you can find a free class for this design if you're interested in learning it. It's called the All Over Feather, and there's definitely a link in almost every YouTube episode. There's a link in the description for it.
Remind them about the QQ.
Mr. Producer's reminding you, if you're asking questions, put a double Q in front of them, please, so that he can run a search and find them.
They're asking about the number of the thread again.
And someone's asking the number of the thread, and it's 0184. So a few technicalities. I'm using 100% poly thread. The brand I've got loaded is Isocord, color number 0184, as I've stated. And it's 40 weight thread, and I've got a 9 stitch per inch length on, and I do have my stitch regulator on at this point. I may take it off later. We'll see. Here we go. And I've got drag, so I'm going to walk around my machine and see what's happening. We've always got so many cables attached and things, so I'm just walking around to make sure I haven't got any of my clips on, because I'm definitely feeling some drag. I'm still feeling it, but it may just, it's not those. Okay, one more time. Okay, I think we're good to go. I do happen to have a ruler foot on my machine, just because this morning I was doing some ruler work and I didn't change it to my regular darning or hopper foot. It certainly is not necessary, but it's not hurting anything either. mode just so that red light is not on for you guys, and that might make it easier to see. Hang on a sec, I want it a little faster than that. That's better. Okay, I've got a magic fix to show you guys. There is a blue thread underneath my cream colored fabric. Can we see that on camera, Dave? Can we see that at all? Okay, bear with us a second. Mr. Producer is going to have a look at the focus and see if he can fix that up a little.
I know how to fix that.
He's quite proud of himself. He knows how to fix that. I'm quite proud of him too, honestly, because I would not know where to start to fix that. And this is something, not the focus, but the blue thread, that happens so often with quilts that have this light colored background. Is you'll have some thread, you know, coming stray or having already fallen off of a block, and it gets in under that light colored fabric, and then you've stitched it down, and what do you do with it? And there's a couple ways to remove it, but my favorite is the one I'm going to show you once we're in focus, because you'll want to see this close up.
I'm trying to.
He's struggling.
I
I thought you knew how to do this.
So did I.
We're working at it. We're working at it. I'd show you the needle, but I really want it to be in focus when you see it, because it's really cool.
It's killing me.
It's not working.
Oh, it's changing the ISO, not the focus.
I hope there's nice music on for you guys. How's it working? If you had it on the big screen, then you would know better.
I can see it, yes.
Okay, he's going to double check it before I get my needle in the view finder. Is that pretty clear? Okay. Still not great, is it?
No, we'll get there.
Oh, hang on. Turns out he was adjusting the ISO, not the focus.
See, can you see it? Is it changing?
It's there we go. That's pretty good.
Is that good?
Pretty good, yes? You guys will chime in, but I think that looks pretty good from where I'm standing. Okay, so here's the needle. Can you see that? So it's not actually a needle. This whole end of it is this kind of roughened edge. This is called a snag nabbit needle. Look at its bowed. Dritz makes them. So what we're going to do is put the needle in the fabric and come up really close to that blue thread, right under it and like one thread past it. That's my goal. And I'm going to gently, gently, gently pull my needle through, and that rough bit is going to hopefully catch my blue thread. And I do this super gently because it is possible to actually tear a fiber and put a hole in your quilt. So I do it slowly and gently. And there's my blue thread poking out. And now I should be able to grab it. Sometimes I have to do it again before I get it up far enough that I can grab it. Looks like I might have to, just to make my life easier. My hand is right in front of the camera now. Come on. I thought I had it, you guys. I thought I did. Let's try it again. Different spot. So I go right under it, pushing it up against the fabric, and then just gently pull that rough bit through. Did we get it this time? If you make a liar of me. Okay, let's get that batting out of there. Try again. It's like having an IV needle. Let me try again. And it may not work while I'm on camera. It's kind of an awkward angle for me and etc. So it looks like I'm not going to get it. So I'm sorry about that. But usually, and I will come back and do this later, usually it's very effective. And then I wanted to show you this tip too. Go into that fabric anywhere, come up near that batting and sweep your needle under, and it pulls that little tail of batting. Run your nail briskly across the holes and they disappear. And you're good to go. So I did not successfully get the thread, but now you know how to do it. Dritz Snag Nabbit needle. I may actually just drop a pin in there so that I remember that later on to come back and get it. That's my trusty marker. Okay, on we go. Back to quilting. As we go, I'd love if you type in the comments what you think of the color of the thread as it appears to you on camera. Like I said, this is kind of my new favorite neutral. It's just slightly silvery, but it works even on white fabric because it just looks like a little shadow. And it doesn't have the blue look that some silver threads tend to get. Whew, it's hard to see on these prints. And we broke a thread. I saw it wobbling. It's funny. I saw it wobble out of the corner of my eye and thought, it's going to happen. And it did. So I will double check my threading. In fact, I think I will just rethread it because I wonder why the wobble, if it's not coming off the spool smoothly or what the scoop is. I saw it sort of flashing out of the corner of my eye. By the way, while I rethread, I do have a series, hopefully growing over time. Right now there's maybe half a dozen in it, called Know Your Machine. And it's on little topics like knowing what your thread looks like as it's feeding through your machine and quickly recognizing any irregularities. It can be very helpful when you're troubleshooting what's wrong. And what I'm going to do now, boy, it's hard to see. I'm going to try to undo just the last few stitches, because there will have been a jerk when the thread broke. The tension will be messed up on them, and also it's much easier to do a splice at a corner, a point. I guess the good news is if I can't see these stitches, nobody else can either. But I will really try to find this enough to get it undone. It is hard to see. I think I got that end all out. I may have to stay in stitch regulated mode for the duration of this quilt. One of the things that I've learned over time is that whenever there are thicker seam allowances, that can mess with the manual speed, because I tend to go fairly fast with it, as you saw, and it really jars and tends to break and shred the thread when I have thick seam allowances. So though I do love stitching in manual mode, it's not always practical. And this quilt, because it was made with, I would say, earlier sewing techniques, so there are some thicker seam allowances where some of these triangle points cross each other and match up. And so the antidote to that, I think, for the purposes of being on air today, is just to stay in the regulated mode, and I will have less breakage. When you're in regulated, then you can, slow down easily when you're coming to some of those points and avoid that thump when you go over them. Okay, you guys aren't going to be able to see this join, so I'll kind of tell you what I'm doing. I've backed up to the point of one of these plumes of my feathers, or almost to the point, so I'm overlapping about 1/4 inch, a few stitches, and I've pulled up my bobbin thread, and I'm just going to do a few really closely spaced lock stitches, and then continue on my stitching, and I will come back and trim those thread tails later. Now you get to see the 2 red eyes again. Pause for a sec and trim those tails. And we're back in business. these calicos are difficult to see on. I'm squinting, getting my nose right in there. There was a thick one right there. Do you hear it going over it? Stick a little. Okay, what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and do my full advance here, sort of in real time as I would do it if I was just working, and then I'll pause for a minute and get a few swallows of coffee and answer any questions or take any comments that you've got at that point. Still in the way, I can't see. That should be pretty good. So here's where I'm pulling up a little on the edges of my batting so that they're not getting stretched out, and also tugging a little in the center to make sure that it's pulled down smoothly. And if you have any doubts about how much that should be, flip your quilt up and have a look at it and smooth it out and make sure there's no creases starting to show where it's pulling out of shape. And it doesn't matter whether you do magnets or basting first, by the way. I usually baste first, but here I am pulling up magnets. My little yardstick at the end that I'm tucking in is just to hold my side clasp up a little bit because I'm so close to my quilting that the nose of my long arm is actually bumping into that side clamp when I get close to it over there. So I just need to hold the clamp up just a touch. Anything long and straight will work. Curtain rod, PVC pipe, whatever. I happen to have old yardsticks. My basting, by the way, is not always pretty. It's got overlaps and doubled up stitches, but that's going to fall within the binding of the quilt, so I don't worry too much about it. But I do try and keep it within that 1/4 inch seam allowance so that I don't have to worry about it. Okay, time for coffee and questions. Mr. Producer's hunting them down. Janice, my machine has precision and cruise regulated mode. One needle stops, other it stitches in place. Does Bernina have similar? And do you have a preference? Yes, we do have similar. I typically use the one where it slowly bounces in place. I have mine at a fairly low setting. I can change how fast that coasting is, if you will. I use the stop in place when I'm doing ruler work so that it does not keep stitching while I'm repositioning my ruler. That's the difference for me. Linda, when in manual mode, how fast is your stitching? I had it at 1420. My preference is about 1500. But again, that's on a pretty smooth quilt where I don't have things I'm going to bump into like thick seams. Michelle, when doing your all over feathers, do you quilt a spine? No, I don't, Michelle, and that's kind of the magic of them, is that you never have to go back over what you stitched earlier and fill in around it. I'm just quilting both sides of the feather as I go. Sometimes 2 and then 3, you know, depending. And that's all in the free class that I was telling you about, and it's in the description below this episode. I think probably below all episodes. Free all over feather class. Susie, do the leaders come with the snapper system? The leaders actually, in my case with the Bernina, come with the long arm frame, and they did with my Gamel as well. I don't know that they do with every brand, the canvas leaders. The red rods were the snapper system, and the side clamps I bought separately, but they're the same brand by the same people. Melody, what is triggering your comma head with this quilt? How do you decide to use it? What's triggering it, Melody, is it's my go-to little extra motif that I tuck into corners because I'm moving around a square quilt with square edges and a very rounded design. So sometimes I need something to put into that long corner. So I could either stretch out a long feather, or I like that little comma head. And then just to keep it cohesive looking, I put it in every so often throughout the whole quilt, whether I need to or not. It just feels like part of the design to me. Lou, do you always stitch within your basting stitch and not off the quilt? Why? I tend to, yes. Here's my reasoning. I don't love the idea of cutting through my quilting threads when I trim up the quilt ready for binding afterwards. I don't feel like those stitches are very secure, especially if you have a little bit longer stitches. The shorter stitch you have, the more secure I guess that is. So that's my thinking. I try and keep my quilting within those basted edges or within what's going to get cut off. And that way there's no thread ends that are left there kind of unsecured. Nita, approximately how big is each feather? Oh gosh, they really, really vary. They're about 1 inch from side to side-ish, and they're about 1.5 inches long, maybe a little smaller than that in some cases, and a little bigger in some, but that gives you an idea. Phyllis, will you please tell how you set up your machine? Stitch regulator on or off, feed dogs down. So I'm working on a long arm, Phyllis, so there actually aren't feed dogs. That's not an option. I can raise or lower my presser foot, but when I start stitching, it automatically lowers, and it is a hopper foot, so it hops with each stitch. What was the other question on it? I'm having a brain cramp. I can't remember what your first question was on that. It was set up on the machine. Here it comes. Oh, stitch regulator on or off. Right now I have the stitch regulator on. A little earlier in the show I had it off. So on the Bernina machine, whenever the stitch regulator is on, there are 2 little cameras on the foot plate that are watching the fabric move, and they each have a red light in them. And so when you see red lights, my stitch regulator is on. C, you're buzzing along but never check tension on the back side. True, I'm a free motion newbie but recently got bit, looking great on top but eyelashes on the bottom. Do you have a mirror or camera under? No to both. A couple of things. Number one, I did a sample before we came on air, although obviously I did not have the quilt loaded. My experience has taught me to be very, very conscious and aware of what my stitches look like, and I don't get tripped up very often. I know what they look like on the front when there's good tension on the back. So I've actually got my front thread just a hair tight, and I can see that. It looks just a tiny bit tight so that I know my bobbin thread is not pulling tight on the back, which I wouldn't be able to see. So I can recognize a stitch, and I can also feel, I'm very attuned, so I can feel if the thread is not flowing smoothly. You heard me talk earlier, perhaps you did. I saw the top thread flash and it broke a second later. I knew that was coming. I saw that flash and I thought something's irregular, and sure enough. And you just get to know your machine and what the stitching looks like. I have stitched so many quilts. That just comes with time. Linda, do you have a specified distance before you throw in the little curlicue, or is it just a filler? Just a filler, as I mentioned earlier. I put it in the design initially to stretch out into longer corners that I needed to fill. And then I've just trained myself to drop it in here and there so that it looks like an intentional part of the design throughout the quilt, not only in the corners and straight edges. Always late. It appears to have a wrinkle on that first star block. Does that not matter? I don't know which block you meant, but there are no actual creases that I'm stitching down. There are some crease lines where it's being folded, but no, I'm not stitching that in. I'm not. I will make sure it is stitching out flat as I go. And the first time it gets washed, even with a bit of use, that's going to flatten right out. Jackie, are you drinking decaf or regular in the afternoon? Regular, and yes, I will sleep tonight. I do know myself, or I wouldn't do it. C, one problem I have is going to bed. I'm still free motioning. Happening to you? Yes, sometimes I dream about quilting. Janice, I have that happen lying there and thinking I'm still quilting. You know, there is some science behind this idea of reviewing a new concept right before you go to sleep, and then it sort of cements, it sort of sets when you're sleeping. And apparently studies have shown that happens like way down in infants. They learn best if they learn something and then take a nap. And so that's my excuse for naps. I feel like that really cements it. All right, that's it for questions. So let's get back to quilting. Those of you who are regulars will know, generally speaking, I alternate my passes. So if I quilted one pass from right to left, then I'll do the next one from left to right, to keep my quilting sort of organic. But in the case of this design, I did that in the process. I kind of do a strip left and a strip back right. So I can start on the right-hand side. I'll start right where I left off and just keep on going. And actually, I'm going to take a second to check how full my bobbin is. My bobbin probably will not make it through this whole pass, but you know, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So again, I just pulled up my bobbin thread, did a few lock stitches, then I leave those thread tails hang, and I just start stitching. So there was one of those comma heads. If I had not done that and just put a comma there, I would have a very awkward space when I came back around that it was difficult to fill. And I've just learned that by experience doing this pattern. So if you take the class and you start putting this on a quilt, you'll soon get that feel for it too. After you've gone left and gone right a few times, you'll get that feel for when you need to be filling in a corner, because you know that if you leave it till later, it's only going to get harder to fill in. It's too bad I've never counted how many quilts I put this design on, but it's a lot. A lot, a lot, a lot. So to the person who was asking if I put spines in the feathers, this is a good pass for watching for that process, because I've got a lot of white fabric happening here. So you'll get an opportunity to really view these feathers as they're being formed. And honestly, if you want to learn to quilt feathers like this, I strongly recommend, number one, taking the class, and then number two, coming and watching one of these episodes, this one or there are several others, in which I'm quilting it, because it will really help you to get a feel for how I turn corners and move around the quilt. And it's kind of like this. I'm quilting a whole bunch of left plumes, if you will, and that's how I'm traveling around a corner. 1, 2, 3, and 4 before I quilt a right-facing plume. So I do talk about that in the class. A huge part of it is about that. How do you move around the quilt top with it? I see my thread flashing. It's come out of a holder. Side note, that's the kind of thing you just gradually, as you get to know your machine better and better, whatever machine you have, you'll get to know what those things ought to look like. And if you see a thread flashing where it shouldn't, right away you'll know something's amiss. And if I had not stopped and corrected that, chances are very good I'd have a broken thread in a moment. So back to learning these feathers. Taking the class is really beneficial because I start right at square one with how to form these feather plumes. But then it goes into how to move around a quilt top. And so I think watching one of these episodes then with your knowledge of the feathers in place will really help you then to understand the movements that I'm making here. So both of them are beneficial. So in the course of a lesson, of course, I don't quilt a whole quilt top, so you don't get to see it, moving in this large of an area. But I do walk you through the steps, bit by bit. So the edge nearer to me now, we're coming to one of these blocks that has the eyelet lace. And I want to have that lace remain unstitched down, so it's kind of three-dimensional. So I'm going to stitch around it and below it, and I'm actually going to hold it back and stitch a little bit under it, but I'm not going to stitch over it. So from the back of the quilt, that's going to look a little funky because you're going to see a little strip that's not quilted. But you have to make choices in quilting, and my choice is I don't want to quilt down that eyelet lace. And I am planning a little bit ahead and stretching further down in this row than I otherwise would have, because I don't want to leave a skinny spot that I have to try and catch in my next pass, if you see what I'm saying. So I filled in all the way above that lace. And when I come back across, I'll fill in the fan. This too is one of the absolute beauties of quilting entirely freehand, is that I get to make those decisions on the fly. I don't have to do any programming or masking or fancy marking, or I don't honestly even know what all you would do if this was a digitized design, because I would not know how to start doing that. I do see that I'm very close to my dead bar right at this position, so I'm actually going to back it up just, I don't know, an inch or so, or I'm going to run into that rail and have a nice little square corner on one of my feathers. That would never do. We were talking earlier about the size of the feathers, and I said about 1 inch by 1.5 inches, so I've been trying to watch them as I've been quilting. And I think that's about right. They're about 1 inch from side to side, for the most part. Certainly there are a few a little less, like that one. One of you was asking about quilting off the edge of the quilt, and you're seeing me now kind of stopping my quilting in that basted edge. And you know, it really is up to you. I know different quilters do approach this differently. I know a lot of digital quilters just extend their design right off the edge and then trim it off. I'm not going to say right or wrong. I'm just going to say I like the idea of having the stitches really secured, and so I prefer to keep all the stitching with as few cut edges near that edge of the quilt as possible. That's just my preference. So in my mind's eye, I pretend like my design is going right off the edge, and I just mentally trim it. And I would imagine there was a time, and certainly with other designs, sometimes I still do this. I'll actually stop and kind of chalk in where it would be, and then that gives me an idea where to nest my quilting and where to edge it and how to travel along in that basted edge. And now I'm going to go run the quilt forward again because I want to fill the whole area of this fan in this pass. And I may have to, in fact I am going to have to adjust my magnets and roll forward a few inches. But I don't want to have to come back in. Not sure what camera you're seeing on, but I want to be able to get the whole fan basically in this one pass, the whole interior of the fan. And fortunately there are only 2 of these blocks in the whole quilt, so it's not like I'll be doing this frequently. I'm just watching my side clamps to make sure that I'm not rolling them up in the process. So while this is a tiny bit fiddly, like I said, there's only 2 of them, so it's not a big deal. think the added little bit of uniqueness is totally worth it. Just gonna get my bearings here for where I am in my feather. I'm going to grab a piece of my trusty blue painter's tape. If you're new here, you maybe don't know that this is my secret weapon. I use it for all kinds of things, but in this case, I'm going to use it to literally tape back. I'm gonna have to do it in chunks, I think. Tape back this eyelet lace so that I can quilt right up close to it. And if the tape won't hold, I might have to pin it. The tape is faster if I can make it hold. Let's see if that works. Get my bearings again. And I am actually making my feathers a little smaller here, just because I've got this little space I'm trying to maneuver around. I don't think anyone looking at the quilt afterwards is going to see that to be true, but it is true. You're leaning on the rail though, that doesn't work, Dave. I feel the resistance. Mr. Producer's trying to help me by holding down the tape. It's kind of like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach all at the same time. I truly love these feathers for their ability to just sneak into the littlest of corners. And I'm just actually going to echo around one because I've got to get out at this top edge of my fan, right? And I've got a very small space to do it in. And we just ran out of bobbin thread right there. Okay, so you get a quick short lesson in how to do this. This is my usual method, let it run out. There are various ways that you can track how much thread is in your bobbin, but none of them are perfect. And so my choice is to just quilt till it runs out and then back up a little bit. And the reason I back up is, number one, it's much easier to join at a point, and number two, because I used every inch of it, the last few inches didn't have good tension, right, as they were coming out of the bobbin casing. And so you got to back up a few inches. There's just no way around it. And I know you can't see it, but I'm just backing up to the last point of this feather, or almost to it. And then we'll have a little bit of overlapping stitching, and that will secure it. And I drop my blue seam ripper right there, because otherwise how will I ever find it? I'm done with those pieces of tape, but we'll save them for the next block. I'm fortunate to have an onboard bobbin winder on my machine. You might have an off-board one, but what I love about this is I choose to wind my own bobbins, and so I usually keep 2 cones of my favorite thread, or 2 spools, that would work too. I'm going to check the tension. And I just have a bobbin winding while I'm sewing, so it's just ready. When I'm ready for it, it's ready to go. And this, by the way, is one of the ways that I establish good tension. And, you know, I'm not always good about checking the TOA gauge, but I'm trying to be better, because I think for the few seconds that it takes, and it just is your first indicator if there is any problems, it's worth it. So I'm trying to learn to do it with every bobbin. And when I'm not on camera, I often will oil with every bobbin as well. When I'm on camera, I tend to do it with every second one. And it seems to be fine, just to save time. So our fan is filling in quite nicely. just double checking my path out. It's like quilting in a maze. So I did have to do one kind of funky little echo there, but again, in the scheme of things across this calico quilt, no one's ever going to know that. But now we've got to tape the other side of this lace out of the way. That tape did not work great, so I'm doing pins this time. I've just got a few corsage pins, and I'm just going to pin it back out of the way. It's a very awkward angle. Sorry. This lace is showing its age just a little bit, but I suspect that with the first washing, that kind of discoloration, that yellowing will probably come out. There's a great product out there that I've used on vintage quilts called Retro Soak, and it's very good at getting out this kind of just yellowish dinginess. I'm trying to make sure that all my pins are out of the way when I'm stitching. Okay, here we go. I'm not going to be as picky here at going all the way to the bottom of it, because I think that I'll be able to catch that on my next pass across fairly readily, so I'll just leave my pins in place and keep on quilting. Very thick seam right there, and I'm kind of purposely stitching really close to it and stitching it down, otherwise it's going to stand up like a little button when my quilt is done. Okay, onwards and upwards. Good opportunity to be typing in your questions. I'm just trying to think here. I can only move a partial pass because of this eyelet. I've got to be able to get at that area still. So I'm just going to keep an eye on that as I'm rolling the quilt and not roll it all the way. And by the way, I am working on a Bernina Q24, so I do have quite a lot of throat space. So it's not the end of the world if I can't, you know, take advantage of all those inches every time. So I'm just watching out of the corner of my eye where that quilting still needs to be done. I think maybe I went a little too far. Back up an inch. There we go. Okay, so back to my process again of making sure the edge of the batting is not stretched out, both sides, and doing a little tug of both quilt top and batting all the way through the middle. I showed you guys my long armor's tape measure at the beginning. I keep an eye on that to ensure that my quilt is remaining as close as possible to the same width all the way down. I also keep an eye on the seams that are running crossways on the quilt and making sure that they're straight on the rail. I can see that right in this area there's a little bit of fullness in the border, but I do not want to pull that down and stretch it out. I want to keep it up, keep these seam lines running nice and straight. That's what keeps me from having a surprise when I get to the end of the quilt. And not a pleasant surprise. All right, let's base these sides. Again, if you have any questions, this is a great time to be asking them. Put a QQ in front of them so we can find them. And while I base this, I know there was a little promo at the beginning about our upcoming cruise, but let me tell you a little about it too. Mr. Producer and I are hosting a long arm quilting cruise January 18 to 25 of 2025. I have to be careful about those dates. And it is in the Caribbean. So Dave's going to put a link in the chat with the website for it if you want more details on it. But let me give you a quick rundown. We're bringing 2 guest quilters. Beth Ann Nemesh is one, Sam Alberts is another. And actually, if you look at my social media this past week, Sam and I did a live little appearance on both Instagram and Facebook, just talking about it, and particularly talking about her classes and her style and what she's going to offer. And I'll be doing the same with Beth Ann throughout June too. But the 3 of us have quite different quilting styles, and we've been talking together to try and coordinate what we're teaching so that each person coming gets a really rich and varied quilting experience. So we're hoping that those who come will take all of the classes, and we're arranging them time-wise so that you can. And you know, my happy place is edge-to-edge quilting, much like this. Beth Ann tends to be very artistic and fairly intricate and super detailed custom quilting. She's such a beautiful quilt artist. And Sam has a much more contemporary vibe. She does a lot of ruler work, a lot of lines, and she's a genius at overcoming what she calls quilter's block. So one of her classes is going to be about that. We've all stood and stared at quilts, especially custom quilts, and thought, what in the world do I quilt on this? So she has some really good tips and a lovely checklist for working through that. So, someone's reminding me to pull the pins out of the lace. Thank you for that. There are still a few in there because I'm not quite done quilting up against it yet. But thank you for the reminder, whoever's telling it to me. And by the way, if you're new to these lives, this is a feature of them. We talk with each other, because sometimes you guys have saved me from myself. But certainly you've reminded me of things like my magnets or things like pins where they shouldn't be. And I appreciate that. That's why we call this a sewing bee, isn't it? Okay, we're all loaded up again. Let me just put my magnets on and grab my coffee mug, and we'll take a few more questions. Yes, thanks for the reminder on the pins. I don't want to roll those up, and that's a fact. Okay, questions. Becky, do you think this would be an acceptable design for a boy quilt? Well, I think it would be acceptable, Becky. I do think it's on the feminine side. I do a version of this in my advanced monthly membership, which is a similar thread path, but pointy plumes instead of the round ones, which looks more boyish to me. But that's just my opinion. But I think it would work. It's quite a traditional design, right? So it has that traditional feel and suits many quilts. Yeah. Mr. Producer's saying you could do it like soldiers in a row, left, right, and it would look like a tractor path. So, you know, there's that. And maybe putting it in rows would make it look more boyish. Might be something to experiment with. Patchwork Peanut, love that. Can a person practice their free motion quilting without using batting just as a cost-saving measure, or would it affect the feel? Can I just use 2 layers of quilting cotton? You probably can. I think you'll have trouble, possibly, with tension. You know, and forming a pretty stitch. Clearly you'll have the movements in place, but here's a couple other suggestions. One is find some charity quilts to practice on. Most guilds have charity arms, like for foster kids, for hospices, things like that. Project Linus is a great place to find actual quilts to quilt on. Failing that, load up ugly fabric, batting, ugly fabric, quilt on it, and when it's full, put another piece of fabric on. So you use less batting, and you can do that several times. Eventually, depending on how thickly you're stitching it, eventually it won't form pretty stitches anymore either. You'll start getting skips and things, and then you know you've done enough of that. But it is a way to save yourself loading time and to save yourself batting and backing fabric too. Cheryl, how far are you stitching from the top leader? Do you aim to stitch the blocks as a row or overlap the sashing and blocks? Love watching your quilting. I mean, I'm moving as though it were a row, but I'm very much, there's a wavy line at the bottom of my row. I don't want it to look like I've stitched in rows, right? I want them to look like they're nesting. So they're fairly irregular, and especially because of this fan that I'm working around now. This last row was really irregular. That's okay by me. Jackie, I have a Q16 sit down and would love to see more live and unscripted sessions using sit down or domestic machine. Is there an option to turn off the bobbin sensor? There is an option to turn off the bobbin sensor. I would look at your manual. Honestly, that's the faster way. I won't take up everyone's time here. And personally, I just ignore the bobbin sensor. It's just a tiny, tiny, tiny red light, and I just ignore it. But I'm pretty sure you can turn it off. More quilting at the sit down or domestic. Do you know, I just got finished recording a whole series of lessons for my freehand quilting masterclass that are at the domestic machine. All those motifs and designs are demonstrated at the domestic. I don't have a great setup in my studio for camera work, so we had to like rearrange everything in order to do it. So I don't know that you'll see anytime soon these live and unscripted episodes being at the domestic for that reason. And also it takes quite a bit longer, so it would be difficult to finish a whole project in one sitting, although you would certainly see the design at work. So I appreciate what you're asking. Duly noted. Linda, what is the going rate per square inch for a motif similar to an all-over feather in your area? I would say 2.5 cents a square inch is very common in my area. You know, I don't know what area you're in, and maybe you want to chime in on that, and we're kind of going down a rabbit trail here, but I would not let what's in your area be too strong an influence. I would start from the vantage point of what you need to earn, and then if what's in your area is considerably lower, then I would start looking for mail-in clients. That's one of the things that I did, not because the rate was cheap where I am, but because our area has a ton of long arm quilters. I live in Spokane, Washington, which is about a 250,000 city. And at one time, our machine quilting guild had over 130 members in it. So we're saturated. And so right off the bat, when I started quilting as a business, I started soliciting mail-in work. And that solves the problem of what my local price may or may not be. Linda, do you let your bobbin winder wind and automatically stop? I've found with my Q20 it doesn't like a full bobbin. And what is the speed of your winder? My winder is at the default, which I think is 62, which is an odd number. A Bernina tech guy recommended to me that I keep it slow, that I don't ramp it up high. When you make it go faster, you tend to exponentially have more tension issues, he felt. So that has served me well. I do let it wind and just stop. If yours is winding too full, look for my Know Your Machine episodes. There's a demonstration in there of how you can change that. You can turn a little screw. It's super simple, and your bobbin sensor will stop a little bit sooner. So if your bobbin is too full and your machine doesn't like it, mine doesn't like them full either, you know, right to the tippy top, you can turn that down so it shuts off a little sooner. Margie, what do you do about those areas where the top has stretched places? Honestly, I'm just smoothing them in. The odd time you've seen me put my left hand on the quilt to kind of nudge those fuller areas in, I'm just making sure there are no pleats. And I see coming up, I have a couple that almost look like creases, but I don't think any of them are going to be problematic in terms of forming a pleat under my needle, but I will be aware of that.
I know you've answered this, but it was earlier.
Jill, you use spray water for the backing, but do you press the quilt top or do anything before quilting? Typically, no, Jill. And on this one, honestly, my top probably would benefit from a light misting too. That would make these creases relax. So far, they've been working okay, so I haven't taken the time to do that. In general, I don't. The way my clients bring quilts is the way I quilt them. And I will use a certain amount of tension on my side clamps or pulled forward to smooth it. But like if they didn't press the seams, I don't press the seams either. So in this case, you're not seeing that though. You're just seeing the creases from folding because it's been folded for quite a long period of time, possibly since the 90s. And those are not proving to be problematic. What are your handle toggles set to? Just curious. This is Kara. So on my right hand, because on the Berninas we can change them, I've got the number 2 is my lock stitch, and I have it set to take 4 lock stitches. So when I hold it down, I get 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches. And my number 1 is my start and stop button. Jackie, how do you deal with the border fullness when you use a sit-down machine? I usually use my domestic machine to base the edges first. Will it be the same way versus on the frame? The same in this sense. If there is any fullness, you need to try to distribute it evenly so that you can ease it in to the backing evenly. You don't want to sort of push it out in front of your presser foot and then all of a sudden get a pleat. So pins are your friend. Pin, pin, pin it in place. And then if you put a little tension on the whole thing, you should be able to base that and it will ease in. And when you release it, it will be eased into the backing, if that makes sense. Hope that helps. Janice, do you have a class on doing machine quilting as a business? I don't, Janice, but there's one in my head, and one of these days it's going to come out. But I'm happy to answer questions. So like if you want to email me, Janice, I know you know how to email me, or maybe I'll tell you in case there are others interested, Susan@StitchedBySusan.com. I'd love to hear questions that you are asking because that will help me. I'm in the process of outlining a course, and so that will help me make sure that I'm answering all the right questions. Okay, let's get back to quilting. How are we doing for time, Mr. Producer, sir?
2 hours.
We're at 2 hours. I think probably we'll do one more pass. That puts us, the middle of this next row is the halfway mark of the quilt. So we'll be a little over halfway at that point. Got to get my yardstick back in. Did I mention this yardstick earlier? Can you see me doing it? All I'm doing is lifting my side clamp so that this, lifting my Bernina side clamp so that my E-edge clamp is hoisted a little bit. If I don't, I'll show you what happens. If I don't and I move my foot over, I hit right into the edge of that clamp, and that's going to give me a square feather. We don't want that. So just by lifting it about a ½ inch, you don't want to overlift or you're going to get skipped stitches too, but lifting it just a little is just the ticket. It's kind of like over egging the pudding if you do it too much, right?
I don't know what that means.
That must be an English saying because pudding means a different thing in Britain than it does here in the US. Little loose piece of I'm going to drop another tidbit in here for you guys. My students will recognize this when they've all heard me say it. It is the tendency of most quilters, myself included, to either get smaller and smaller as you proceed down a quilt, or get looser and looser as you proceed down a quilt. So my antidote to that, when I find it happening a lot to me, is in my first pass on the quilt, I will draw out my design, either on a piece of paper or a piece of plexi beside me, just exactly the same size and proportions as I'm doing it on the quilt top. If you have a way of tracing it, you can even do that. Trace some of your early quilting. Then I keep that piece of paper, plexiglass, whatever it is, beside me at my long arm or my quilting machine. And every so often I refer to it to kind of gauge what size have I been making these plumes actually. And I see a spot here where I can't get to it. I did not see that when I was rolling it up. So far back I can go with my magnets still on. I think that'll do it. I know you guys can't see a wink on this calico. Now that I'm out of that awkward corner, I'm going to put it back where I had it. It does not like to move. Those magnets don't like to slide. Come on now. There we go. watching today that are new viewers. If you're enjoying this, well, really all of you, I would love if you would take a moment to give it a thumbs up, maybe even share if you think you have quilting friends who would enjoy this style of quilting that I do, the edge-to-edge quilting, but also just my style of teaching and presenting. It is certainly our goal with these live and unscripted episodes to give you an honest look into my life as a quilter. And so these episodes are not edited, other than we take off a bit of the intro at the beginning when we're still ironing out our sound and so forth, but we don't edit out the hard parts. And if you go back and watch any episodes from the past, you will find some in there that were rough quilting days, to put it lightly. And I go ahead and leave those in because so many of you have responded that those have been some of the most encouraging episodes for you. So this truly is quilting's first reality show, but you definitely get to see the things happening in real time. And I talk very honestly about things like how often do I change a needle or a bobbin, etc. So I appreciate you being here, and it really helps me get more visible if you will take a moment to thumbs up and share these episodes if you're enjoying them. I appreciate it. There are a few other things on my channel. I've mentioned a couple times my Know Your Machine series, which is not Bernina specific, although a couple of them are. Let's put it that way. But for the most part, they're not. They're just about knowing whatever machine you're working at. So that's one of them. I also have a podcast which currently is not receiving many new episodes, but we are putting all of the episodes onto YouTube so that you can listen and watch them, if you will, there, and they all have lots of photographs of quilting in the background. So it's an easy place to find them, and they're all organized in a playlist. My Q24 does have the Qmatic system, which is Bernina's digitizing software or digitizing program, and we actually recorded something new yesterday, which I have not released yet, but it's an episode all about editing a digitized program where, you know, the stitches aren't quite right, they're not quite lining up at the repeats. And so my friend Betty is super knowledgeable about that, so she joined me and we recorded an episode on that. So that's quite fun, and I think I've got one live and unscripted out in the world where I did an edge-to-edge design on the Qmatic with the digitized system. So if that's your thing, you might find that helpful. It's the same style, it's just real-time, an honest look at how things look in my studio. And don't forget the cruise. I know I've mentioned it a couple of times already. This is a first for Dave and I to host a cruise, so there's lots of things we're learning as we go. And one of them is kind of how many, single occupancy, how many double occupancy, etc. And we had to sort of make that judgment call when we were reserving the rooms. So at this time, we are sold out of single occupancy rooms. So we're trying to, in an effort to help you guys, we're trying to arrange some kind of share a room contacts so that you can folks if you wish to share a room with them. The best price is, of course, on the double occupancy. It always is. And we're really trying to get as many berths as we can sold before the middle of July. At that time, we kind of have to make a final judgment call on our size. And if it's looking like it's going great guns, we'll hang on to the last of the rooms. If it's looking like, I don't know, we have to make a decision, in other words. To hold every room that we have reserved so far, we have to make a deposit on them in July. So I'll just be upfront about that. So we have to make decisions. So if you're thinking about going, it would be lovely if you would go ahead and book the room before mid-July. Then we absolutely know that those rooms will be available. It's kind of, I talked a bit about our class content earlier, but more about the cruise in general. It's on the Equinox is the boat. And there are 3 at-sea days, and that's when the classes are concentrated. And then, of course, you still have the opportunity and the option to do any shore excursions on the in-port days and any of the entertainment that the ship offers. So ours comes in the form of a conference fee that gives you access to all of the classes. And then also we have a few VIP slots yet which have additional access to us as teachers, some question and answer panels, things like that. And then the other thing we're adding, which I've never seen, well, two things that I've never seen in quilting cruises before. One is that all the class content is going to be professionally videoed so that everyone who attends the cruise gets to take that home with them. And then secondly, we are, all three of us, are quilting business entrepreneurs. It is our livelihood. And so we're doing some, a little more casual business breakouts, we're calling them, on various topics. Janice was asking if I have a class on the quilting business, and no, I don't, but this is a great opportunity to not only hear from me, but also Beth Ann and Sam. So there's some really good wisdom there, I feel like. And we would love to have you on board. It's just that simple. I live in Washington State, so the idea of being in the Caribbean in January is just a wonderful thing. I'm approaching the end of this pass, so why don't you all chime into the comments if you would like to stay for another pass. Mr. Producer and I will kind of confer here and see if we can do that. I'm willing if all of you would like to continue to watch. I don't think there's any chance I'll get the quilt finished because I think that would take another solid hour and a half. But I will happily do another pass if you all would like to see it. So let us know. And failing that, at least if you have any questions or comments, be typing them in. So I'm going to be at the end here in just a couple of minutes. Don't forget a QQ in front of the questions so we can pull them up for the search. It's so very helpful. One of the advantages of stopping for a few moments at the end of each pass and getting questions from you all is I really think it's important for long arm quilters to physically take a break. You get, I do anyway, get very sort of nose down focused on the quilting, and I've learned to keep my hands pretty softly on the handlebars, but still my neck gets very tired when I, am focusing on a design. So I think it's important that we stop and take a break. So you guys serve as my break when I need to just rest and regroup. When I'm doing this at home by myself, I will literally stop and do some shoulder rolls and some arm swings and maybe some squats and just get blood flowing. It's a great idea. Mr. Producer brought me some water. Lovely. So good. Okay, let's not forget those pins.
So Mr. Producer will stay if all 140 of them were watching. Will like and subscribe and share with somebody.
Mr. Producer says he'll stay and man the controls if all 140 of you will give it a thumbs up and at least 50% will share. He's holding you guys to ransom. But I'm certainly going to go ahead and advance, and then we'll see if there are any questions that we can chat about, and I'll wait to see what everyone's feeling is about quilting a little longer. Can you see that I'm actually pulling on my quilt? You can't really, but I'm right at the edge, and I'm down on the under my dead bar and even at my quilt roll up, and I'm tugging on the quilt. And if I see it wanting to migrate in, I will literally, usually I stand on the other side, but I will literally grasp this and press it out toward that outside edge. It's wanting to pull up as it's being quilted, right? And you need to combat that. And the larger the quilt, the more you have to put effort into that. That really helps in maintaining squareness. overall. Remember, this side has the selvage edge, so that's why I'm basting a little bigger distance in than I usually do, and I'm actually going to trim a little bit of that selvage off. It's just, you know how selvage is, a bit thicker, a bit stiffer, and I don't feel like I want that to remain in the finished quilt. This is going to be tricky. I don't have a long straight edge to put into my side clamp. We're going to do our best. See how that works. So here where I've got this, there's not much anymore, but there was a little fullness in this side border. I can either grab it with my fingers and be pulling it under the needle a bit faster, or you might see me just using my thumbnail when it's a small amount. Can you see that? And it just pulls it under the needle fractionally faster than it would otherwise, or at the very least it does not let it push forward under the hopper foot. And that is important. And it's what's the word I want? Cumulative. That's the word I'm after. So if you don't do it and you accumulate fullness, you're going to be in trouble. But if you master that little bit with each pass, with each inch or two, every time there's fullness, you can handle quite a lot of it just by keeping on top of it. All right, what is the thinking, Mr. Producer, sir? Questions? Yeah.
I have questions. Everybody will stay.
Everybody wants to stay quilting?
Munched it.
How nice. Okay, let's have some, let me get my coffee. Hang on a sec. Coolish coffee. Not quite iced, but cold. And by the way, I'm standing back from the quilt a little bit so I don't drip on it. Becky, how fast do you have your machine set for the manual mode? I turned mine on for the first time recently and it startled me. Today I had mine set at 1400. 14 or 15 is kind of nice for me with an edge to edge that's fairly big. When I'm doing tinier things like pebbles or smaller designs, I would have it much, much slower, maybe 500 or 600. So start somewhere in there. C, is there an option to add black light to see thread path pattern like Anova has? The Bernina machine does not have black light on it. I'll tell you, this is just my personal experience. My last machine did have black light and I did not find it honestly helpful. I have my go-to when lighting is poor and I have a calico like I have today that's difficult to see on. My answer is to turn all the lights in the room out and the lights on my quilting machine and get a lamp and shine it from the side. So I have a kind of gooseneck lamp that I can adjust and I shine it sort of low down across my quilt and basically cause there to be shadows wherever there's quilting and quilt by shadow. That's what I have found to work the best in extreme difficult to see situations. Jenny, if you were to do blocks separate from the sashing and borders, would you stitch in the ditch around them first or not? Meaning if I were doing different quilting in the blocks, sashing and borders, I tend to stitch in the ditch. It gives a more finished look. However, it's extremely time consuming. So if you're trying to do something custom but not spend a lot of time on it, stitching in the ditch is the first thing to go. It's really, really time consuming. Does Betty have her own channel on editing? Betty does have a YouTube channel. I'll give you her website and you can find her from there. How's that? Betty's So Fun. So Betty 'S SEW Fun. Mr. Producer is going to put it in the comments for you too. Betty's So Fun. That's her website. She does have a YouTube channel. I think it's the same name, but I'm not 100% sure. And I'm not sure how much content is there. But she does have some courses and classes. And we talk about them in our episode, which we hope to release this coming week. And we talk about them a little bit, because that is her happy place, is computer work, digitizing things. She's very good. Why are there 2 laser dots? Because there are actually 2 cameras. They're 2 little white boxes. And I don't think that the red is the camera. It's just a pretty light. I'm not sure why they made it that way, but they're 2 little cameras from underneath. How much space do you have on that side of the frame to move around? You look fairly close to the wall. I have about 2 feet between the front rail and the wall. So I'm not very far from it, it's true. And most people would have their long arm the other way around. I do this for camera reasons and also because there's a window in front of me and I love that. I get morning sun in this room and I love facing it. So that's just me. Linda, after checking threading, in what order do you check variables on thread breakage? Threading would certainly be first, both top and bottom. Probably needle would be second. Cleaning, thorough cleaning of lint everywhere would be third. And then maybe some threading factors like, do I need to thread net on my cone? You know, is it catching anywhere? Checking for any burrs in any of the thread guides, that sort of thing. That should get you started. How are we doing? A few more? Lauren, do you trim the quilts for your customers or send them back in the rough? I typically quilt them, Lauren. That's just my choice. A lot of quilters don't, and I don't charge for it. Over time, it seems like a lot of my clients have been elderly ladies who maybe don't have the space or the agility to, for example, do it on the floor, which is where I did it for a long time. I now have 2 tables because I have a separate kind of cutting room. And so it's easy for me because I have those tables, and so it's just a service that I offer. Unless they ask me not to, I just trim them up before I send them back. And I send them all the bits too. They get all their fabric bits back, but yeah. Okay, we're deciphering this. Can you tag at the end videos on how you load your quilt with the wheel on top? I have a 5-inch frame. Do you mean a 5-foot frame? We might need more clarification on that. We might need more clarification on that. Okay, that's the last question. One more sip and we're going to get quilting.
A number of people have had to go for dinner, but there's a bunch of you.
I'm just going to check my bobbin because I'm close to the edge here because I suspect it's very, very low. It is quite low, so I'm just going to go ahead and change my bobbin just for the sake of ease. And this time I am going to check the tension and oil. Well, I sure appreciate those of you who are choosing to stay on. How fun. Helps me to get the quilt done.
She says yes, but I don't know what she says yes about.
So I think the yes is from the lady who has a 5-foot frame. But I'm still not fully sure what you mean by with a wheel. Or do you mean the... I'm sorry, I'm just not exactly understanding what you're asking. I do know that a lot of my live and unscripted videos, I show the loading process. And certainly if you look at them in the beginning, the first 10 minutes, you'll see, am I focusing on the loading or not? There are a few I've done that they were already loaded because I was focusing on something else that show. But for the most part, you get to see the loading. And I believe in April, I was doing little daily snippets, and there's a whole playlist in April. And I believe there's one in there where I had a camera on the, like my side of the machine, so you could see the rails as I'm seeing them. So maybe that would answer your question. I'm just gonna run my machine along and make sure I can reach all of these. And look, I've overestimated again. To back up just a touchy touch. So I think what we're going to do this time, because you can see my next fan block is coming up here, I'm going to try to do a wide feather and then save this entirely for the next pass. I don't know. I'll see how I feel when I come to it. How's that? I do tend to make decisions on the fly. Okay, let me do that again. It did not feel right the first time, so let me pull it out. Try again. This comes under the heading of know your machine. Know what this feels and looks like when you pull up the bobbin thread. And if it feels like there's a jerk or it's not smooth like it ought to be, stop and check your bobbin, because it'll just cause you grief if you don't. Oh gosh, get those thread tails out of here. Tricky calicos again. As you can see, I decided not to do a giant wide swath. I am a bit of a creature of habit, and so I have this kind of method I use to move around. It's basically a giant meander is my thread path, but I have this kind of mental, way that I shape it, and so it helps me fill in 1-2 passes across my 24-inch space. And so that just, it feels so comfortable for me. And if I change that up, then I'm kind of all out to sea as to where to go next with my feathers. And certainly I could figure it out. But when I'm kind of quilting with half my mind on the quilting and the other half on my talking, it's easier to just go with what I know. So I will work that fan out when I get there. thick one. You see how I'm kind of just manipulating that fabric around a little bit to pull it under the needle and keep any pleats from forming. There's no particular magic to that. That is, I'm sad to tell you, that is just a matter of experience. I somehow seem to have a knack for kind of crazily pieced quilts. I've done well, maybe it's just the law of averages, but over the years I've done a lot of quilting for either first-time quilters or, as I mentioned earlier, you know, often elderly ladies who, you know, perhaps their eyesight isn't what it once was, or whatever the case may be. Anyway, I have over time worked up a significant amount of experience in dealing with wonky quilts in various ways. And I'm happy to say that I honestly don't mind it. It is challenging, but it's also very rewarding to take a quilt that, you know, for whatever reason, someone's maybe tired of it or discouraged with it or wasn't happy with how it turned out, and then you add quilting to it and they're like, oh my gosh, that looks really, really good. Somehow that extra layer of quilting is the fun layer that I get to add that just finishes quilts off. So it is, like I said, while challenging, it is also an honor to get to take people's less than perfect projects and make them look really, really good. This one is, I think, exemplary piecing, honestly, for the time frame that it was done in, because I'm pretty sure this was pre-rotary cutter day and pre, you know, squaring up your blocks before you move on days, and so quilts of that era often are not this flat or well pieced. So whoever made it was a very good quilt maker, very good sewist. I don't think I actually said while I was on air today, it is in the description. This quilt belongs to my niece by marriage, Kat, and one of her aunts is who made it, but I don't even know her name. And so this will be a family treasure. Just to give you an idea of time for this entire quilt on a typical day, there are 5 rows of the blue blocks, and I'm just approaching number 4. So this one down here is number 4, and then one more. So you all have been here while I've been quilting, and I mean, if you subtract the time that we stopped betwixt and between to talk, you can get a pretty good idea of the amount of time that it takes for a quilt this size. I'm going to pull the long arm up a little just so I'm sure I can get all the way down to that white fan area. And again, my magnets don't want to release. There we go. I think I can already. I just want to be sure I don't get a square feather there. Trying to decide if I should, I think I'll fill in the top edge of it, and then when I'm coming back around I will come in from the bottom and fill it up and then exit out the bottom too. Don't think there's a wrong way to do that, there's just the way that I think will fit best with my quilting path and an overall pass across the quilt top. And there we have it. All right, folks. Oh, I guess I have to take the clamp actually off, don't I? Okay, there's a moment if you want to put up any last comments or questions as I roll this forward, and then I think we'll call it a day and we'll head off for our dinner as well. This has been really fun. Again, if you're enjoying this unscripted style, would you give it a thumbs up, please? And if you have a moment, share it with some of your quilting friends that you think would enjoy this as well. I so appreciate that. We do, over time, we have tried to do these live and unscripted episodes 2 Fridays a month. In recent weeks, that has not been working out all that well, but I do try and send out an email a couple of days in advance of each of them with sort of what's on tap, what the lesson, what the topic is going to be. So if you're not already signed up for my newsletter, you want to do that. You can do that easily by going to my website, StitchedBySusan.com, and you'll get a little pop-up window that invites you to leave your name and email address. I think you even get a few freebies for it, but that will ensure that you receive the emails with notifications. Baste and I'll be all set to go, and I probably will not finish it after dinner tonight. I'll probably leave it for tomorrow. Here's a good example right beside me here of a crease that's fairly firmly pressed in, and I'm just pulling it out flat and smooth. And as long as I have that flat when I'm quilting over it, that will not pose a problem at all. last snip. Okay, we're set up, ready to go. And in case anybody was wondering, I've had a few students ask me this. Is it okay to leave a quilt on overnight? Does it matter if you have the tension on it? Etc., etc. I leave them on overnight all the time. Now, I don't know that I would leave it for days and weeks, but I leave them on overnight on the regular. I just move my machine off and turn it off. I don't want any oil to drip. I've never had that happen on this machine, but I don't want to risk it, and so I would just move my machine completely off the quilt, turn everything off, and then I come back in the morning and start up again. It's just that simple. Okay, couple questions. Cheryl, how long does it take you to quilt a queen size quilt using a feather stitch pattern? I don't know if I could say exactly, Cheryl, but I'm going to estimate 5 hours, about that. You know, I take breaks, so I never sort of clock it from beginning to end altogether. I just don't, but Sue is asking which BSR are you using or in manual mode. Mostly, Sue, I've been using BSR 1, and that's for Bernina Stitch Regulator, and 1 is our coast. So, you know, the needle is bobbing even when I'm sitting still. That's what BSR 1 does, and that's what I've been using. I tried manual early on, but I have some thick seam allowances, and I broke a thread and decided that wasn't worth it. Carrie, is the second spool for winding bobbins? That's correct. And that is not essential. You absolutely could just have one spool, but then you would probably want to estimate your bobbins and wind them all in advance so you didn't have to unthread in order to wind bobbins. But especially for my common threads, I just keep 2 on hand, 1 for bobbins. Adele, please encourage her to label it with as much info as possible. It's a beautiful quilt and could end up in a museum someday. No more anonymous quilters. Good point, Adele. Thank you for sharing that. I'm poor myself at labeling. I've gone so far as to get little tiny tags that I sew into the binding, which at least have my name on them, but they don't really give any information. So I will suggest that to Kat and even offer to help her do it. I'm just adjusting my wire here. Apparently I have a little wire loop. There we go. Look at that. Melody, this is the first live and unscripted I've watched all the way through. I have 3 pages of notes. Well, the good news is, Melody, they're not going anywhere. You can always come back and capture them later, recapture them, whatever the case may be. But I'm so glad you stayed for the whole thing. Karen, does your bobbin case have a backlash spring? How often does it need adjusted or changed? It does have a backlash spring. I don't think I've ever actually changed one, although they're fairly easy and fairly inexpensive to do. I do keep 2 entire bobbin casings on hand, and sometimes when I have tension issues, I can just use a different one, but it still has that same backlash spring. The only reason I can think why you wouldn't have it is there are certain magnetic bobbins or bobbin genies that do the same purpose, keep your bobbin from springing when you stop stitching and unwinding. So you need something to do that for you, for sure. And I choose to stick with the bobbin backlash spring. Yeah. That's the last question. Okay, you guys, thanks for sticking it out. This has been really fun. It's been fun for me and enjoyable to sew with you all this afternoon and chat with you. I sure do appreciate it. Again, the thumbs up, I so appreciate that, and it gives me a little more visibility, and especially if you would take the time to share with your quilting friends, I'd appreciate that too. Until next time, have a great rest of the day.